22 years after you led us through 9/11, the hot TikTok trend today is that Osama bin Laden was right. Your thoughts?
Yeah, it's very, very disappointing, but it is a product of our unbelievable ignorance and lack of attention to what has been done to us, the infiltration that's gone on over the last 30 years by China, by the communists, by the radical Muslims. Most of what I hear says to me, these people are extraordinarily ignorant. They've never picked up a history book. Some of the biggest colonizers in history was done in the name of Muhammad. Muhammad spread his religion by warfare. So, let's get real. And some of the biggest empires were Muslim empires. And the first extermination and mass grave for Jews was done by Muhammad. So I know that's not politically correct, what I just said. It just happens to be accurate.
Yeah.
And therefore, to try to accuse this country of being a colonizer, when we are the least, whatever transgressions we have, if you look at the history of the world, America's the only country that's given up its young men to free other countries and not take any territory. Colin Powell was always very, very proud of saying that. We're the only country that left our young people to die, and all we asked for a nice cemetery in France. We didn't ask for France. We didn't ask for Italy. We didn't ask for Germany. We allowed Russia to take it, probably because of the influence of communism way back then in the Roosevelt administration. But the reality is that we've let this happen to us. And now we've got to dig our way out of it. And we have a group of people that are too ignorant not to be brainwashed. They're perfect vessels for what our founding fathers worried about. The tyranny of the majority would come about when our population was too ignorant.
Yeah.
And when you listen to these people, my goodness, if you asked them who the president was, I'm not sure they would know.
Yeah.
It's unbelievable, the lack of knowledge of history.
They don't get any.
We're going to have to educate. We're going to have to teach our young people how to critically think. We got a big job ahead of us. But it begins with 2024 and defeating these people and getting them out of office. I've always thought the Democrat Party should change its name. It's the party of slavery. If they're going around changing all kinds of names and taking down statues because of slavery, there's no institution that has more to do with slavery than the Democrat Party. None, not even close. But what the heck they do in carrying that name? What a bunch of hypocrites. So maybe they should start a new party. They should begin with loyalty to the United States.
That's well said. Very well said. Mr. Mayor, we appreciate you coming on.
Thank you. Great job. You do a great job.
Thank you, sir, very much. I appreciate that. All right, I want to bring in veteran journalist Rick Leventhal, also Dr. Zuhdi Jasser, co-founder of the Muslim Reform Movement. Gentlemen, good to have you both on. Dr. Jasser, I want to start with you. This cancerous ideology, they call it the woke mind virus. I can't think of a better name for it. It now has young people validating the 9/11 attacks, validating Hamas beheading children. The West is becoming a terrifying place rapidly.
Yes, there's no doubt. And listen, I was testifying to Congress in 2011, 2013, 14, 17, multiple times about the threat of radical Islam, especially political Islam, that ultimately is unmoored. It is working with the red-green axis, the neo-Marxists globally, along with the Islamist movement. So the Irans of the world are radicalizing our youth, along with the Chinas of the world. And that infiltrated, we were talking about wokeism before anybody knew what wokeism was, and that the wokists used an end justifies the means mentality. And then we saw it in the pandemic as our cities were violently destroyed, our businesses were ransacked, and people were violently attacked, all as a part of some type of movement against America. And I can tell you that ultimately, as a naval officer, we need to be on the offense. We've had no offense to infiltrate their ideas. And the way to do that is to talk about just war. I, as a Muslim, would say that the just war that Israel is undertaking is to free Palestinians from the horrors of Hamas. That is a just war. That's the offense that we need to have. And ultimately, I would disagree, for example, with Rudy's comments about Muhammad. I think as a naval officer, you can't reform a faith and if you demonize the entire population. So ultimately, the reform for Islam is to say, well, if you are not a pacifist as a Muslim and you believe in just war, then be loyal to the countries that you belong to. They give you freedoms to practice your faith. the worst countries that you're escaping are Muslim dominated. So therefore reform the ideas to come to terms with modernity. And that's how we defeat these viral ideas.
Rick, you know, it's really sad to see how this is a really, really dangerous threat to this country. This ideology is everywhere around us, and now we're starting to see, people were fine with it a few months ago, but now we're starting to see how dangerous and violent it is. And you're still seeing it marginalized.
It's beyond disgusting, Rob, and unfortunately it illustrates just how idiotic so many of our young people are, that they would idolize and romanticize this guy who killed thousands of innocent civilians. Osama's letter to America was the 2 jet planes flying into the Twin Towers and all the other jets that they hijacked, all the other people who were killed, innocent civilians who were killed, and all the attacks on our service members overseas. This guy was the worst scum of the earth. They're trying to romanticize terrorism now. They're trying to voice support for opposition when the opposition is carrying out slaughters of innocent children. And these are children who are saying this. As you mentioned, many of them were not alive on 9/11. They didn't experience it for themselves. So they don't have that benefit of history, of living it and being horrified by it. Instead, they're trying to make this out to be something it isn't. And supporting Osama bin Laden has to be one of the worst things. It's as bad or worse than supporting Hamas.
Yeah. Every time I think it's not going to go any further, they do it again. I mean, today was just mind-boggling to watch. Dr. Jasser, you talk about fighting back against it. For those who are curious how these anti-Israel, pro-Hamas protests are coordinated, the Free Press revealing that the pro-China Marxist traders who are funding all of this chaos, a guy named Neville Singham and his wife Jody Evans, a very interesting write-up on them. Couple pumping millions of Singham's money into his nonprofit called the People's Forum, which has co-organized at least 4 of these anti-Israel protests. The Free Press reporting that Singham is a China sympathizer. He lives in Shanghai. He has close ties to at least 4 propaganda news sites that boost the Chinese Communist Party's image abroad. His wife is a total lunatic who once argued that China's treatment of Uyghurs was not as bad as the U.S. treatment of prisoners at Guantanamo. At least China, she said, was not torturing and keeping people in jail for 16 years with no due process. So she's comparing innocent Muslims in China to people who murdered thousands of Americans, hoping to make an equivalency there. We have to wake up. We have to stop the spreading of this cancer. And we have people all over this country spreading it every way they can.
And listen, when we talk about national sovereignty, our sovereignty is not just the border that's hemorrhaging and allowing people to come in that don't even have anything to do with our national social contract. We should be vetting them for ideas, for threats regarding ideas like the Communist Party of China, and not let them in. But at the end of the day, we've surrendered all of that. It's not just the bin Ladens. There's the Imam Awlaki, who declared war against us and had tens and thousands of videos in which he said many things like this letter and radicalized Muslims all over the world until we got him in a drone in 2010. And at the time, many Muslims said, oh, that was inappropriate, etc. And we spent more time worrying about how to bury bin Laden at sea so that we didn't offend people, rather than actually fighting the ideas in an offensive way and targeting them. We used to have a U.S. information agency that was empowered to target ideas and create things like Radio Free Europe. And right now, the best anti-nuclear program in Iran would be empowering the women's movement. But the Biden administration and Obama before them decoupled all of that, disenabled all of that. We had no forward information program, so we're being destroyed by the wokists and the Chinese parties and others that are threatening us from within. That is our greatest enemy, is within, not from abroad.
That's well said. Rick, final thoughts. Go ahead.
Rob, the protests that you showed outside the DNC, where they were moving dumpsters in front of the exits, and they were attacking Capitol police officers who were deemed heroes by the Democrats on January 6th. Now, all of a sudden, they're the demons because they actually engage with these violent protesters. And the fact that the media is ignoring the contrast, the hypocrisy that's there when you're tolerating the violent protests because they're leftists and condemning the other protests because they happen to be conservatives is appalling to me.
This isn't the country that we grew up in, that's for sure. This is a different place now, in a lot of different ways. Rick Leventhal, Dr. Zuhdi Jasser, thank you both. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Coming up, another example of that. Days after House Republicans find evidence that Biden was lying about his quick return of stolen classified documents, his sham special counsel panics and announces
which is what I did. He testified before the judiciary.
Doing everything you can. Colors.
Add some color.
Also affecting the federal government. As I'm sure you're aware, the Government Accountability Office noted that 17 of 24 major federal agencies headquarters in the D.C. are less than 25% occupied. How much does GSA spend annually to maintain and operate office space for federal agencies?
Thanks for that question, Congresswoman. We talked about this a little bit in the first session. We have a federal buildings fund is where agencies that have space in buildings or have leased space pay rent effectively.
Right.
And so that amount every year is around more or less $11 billion.
11 billion.
And that's just rental payments. So
Rental.
that's different than your question, which
Right.
was about how much we spend.
To maintain.
Right. So what happens is that federal buildings fund actually is shorted every year in what we're allowed to spend. So typically what will happen, about half of our portfolio is leased and half is owned. And so for the leased portion, that rent just immediately goes out the door and pays the owner of the building, right, in whatever the community the building is in. And the other half is meant to go back into maintenance of the building.
I'm not going to carry as much news, but it is.
Having conversations, and if you take that away, what's the use?
Yeah, it's right. I mean, I always say this, and Carl DeMaio, tell me if I'm wrong. If I'm in high school, I should never know my teacher's political ideology. Never know it. In college, I can know it, but don't tell me that I'm wrong because I'm not the same.
But if you do know your teacher's political ideology, they should be very receptive to your ideas and challenge you, and also be willing to be challenged. My debate coach in high school, a far left Democrat. He made me better, but he never made me feel marginalized or ashamed, and that's what that professor did to that entire class.
Yeah, Kevin Cork, you in 1 second, but first the nightcap poll. Should college professors lecture their students on political ideology? Yes, 3%, no, 97%. Instagram, 97%. Professors should not be teaching, says Mike, their opinions. They should be teaching students to develop critical thinking skills that enable them to decide for themselves. Kevin Sweeney says it's not a level relationship to disagree with the assistant professor, puts the student at a disadvantage, jeopardizes their ability to participate in class and their grades. And Tommy says the professor should oblige by Socrates. Democracy is only as good as the education that surrounds it. Nicely said, Kevin Cork.
Yes, indeed. Listen, I had a great professor who once said the two best parts of my job are to instruct and to inspire. Inspire you to think for yourself. And too often now, students in college campuses, they're shading the way they write their papers because they're afraid of stepping out of line. That shouldn't be.
Yeah, Kevin Cork, great stuff. Thank you all for joining the Nightcap, and thank you all for watching America's Late News, Fox News at Night. I'm Trace Gallagher in Los Angeles. We'll see you right back here for a Friday night version of America's Late News.
So have we not seen any of it?
So I don't think we're seeing it here. I think there is something to the UFO phenomenon, what the government now calls UAPs. But I think the answers are going to lie in science that we don't yet understand. And this could be very weird stuff. I mean, it's atmospheric science, meteorological science, astronomy that we don't yet understand, and the basics of physics that we don't understand.
This is an incredible book, and you've heard it here first, everyone. Garrett Graff telling me there's no intelligent life
We are in Washington, D.C., after all. The book, UFO, the inside story of the U.S. government's search for alien life here and out there. Thank you all for watching. Our coverage continues. This is interesting.
First. Gen X, Gen Y.
Number order. Earliest reservation.
This is not to say that we don't need to invest.
So I jumped right back on it. I feel.
And it's great to hear, Ms. Carnahan, that you don't force agencies. So you act as sort of the procurer of space, whether rented or purchased, on behalf of federal agencies. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So federal agencies are tantamount to being your client.
Yes, sir. We collaborate with them closely.
Right. And you try to make happy clients, presumably.
Yeah, we work on that very hard.
Would it be fair to say that the FBI is not a happy client right now?
We will see how happy or unhappy they are, but yes, I've received letters from the director that indicate he is unsatisfied.
Right. Let's stipulate you got an unhappy client right now, and let's probe why. So, before revisions were made to criteria that had been established in July of this year. Is that correct?
Yes.
And what happened was you changed the weighting of those criteria, which I'll editorialize, certainly seemed to favor one party over another, but you changed the weighting. That's correct?
So I'm
just that's a pretty simple. You changed the weighting that existed previously to something different in July.
We did,
and at that time, you replaced a career civil servant who was overseeing the expert panel of 3 with a political appointee, this Nina Albert. Is that correct?
We replaced someone with the top real estate professional at the agency.
Yeah, let's not editorialize. She's a political appointee. She was. Is that correct?
That's correct. And the top.
And is she still at GSA?
She's no longer at GSA.
So right after she did the overturn of the panel of expert witnesses that unanimously chose a different site, the one in Springfield, Virginia, she left the agency. Is that correct?
She's now the deputy mayor.
I know what she is. She left the agency was my question.
That's correct. She's
That's
now the
right.
deputy mayor.
So in this process, did GSA diminish the weighting of proximity and FBI mission category from 35 to 25%?
So I don't have all of those numbers in front of me, but there was.
Let's stipulate the answer is yes.
Okay.
And by the way, you changed the name to make it maybe less favorable to the FBI from FBI mission as a category to proximity. Did at that same time GSA diminish the weighting of the transportation category from 25 to 20%?
I think I don't have, as I said, that.
Let us stipulate the answer is yes.
All right.
Did GSA increase the weighting of equity and cost categories from 25%?
I don't have a clue what that was about other than FBI.
Do it for the city. And it is pretty clear. The city is grateful. Some welcome news of hope and resilience in the town of Lewiston, Maine. And one more very, very special note tonight. This one's a good one and a sad one. I want to say goodbye and congratulations to my dear, dear friend, our executive producer, Lauren Peikoff. She is moving on to bigger and better things within MSNBC. We are not letting her go. She is the most devoted producer. I want you to know this. She lives and breathes the news every single day. And I have been blessed to have her by my side. Lucky me, unlucky her for the past 5 years.
Okay.
Aids to slavery and rape, survivors describe some of the worst atrocities of Sudan's brutal war.
Live from CNN Center, this is CNN Newsroom with Michael Holmes.
But we begin with Israel's war with Hamas. Israel releasing images that it says show a tunnel shaft used by Hamas. It's on the grounds of Gaza's largest hospital, which has been under siege for days amid growing outrage. Now, CNN cannot confirm the authenticity of this Israeli military video, which also shows a nearby building from the Al-Shifa complex. The Israel Defense Forces have faced mounting pressure to justify their raid on the hospital, which Israel says conceals what it called a Hamas terror headquarters and tunnel network. So far, the proof that Israel has called concrete has been less than overwhelming. But the IDF insists more evidence is coming and that it is carrying out a careful operation that could take weeks. The army also releasing images of weapons it says were found at the hospital complex. Hamas has repeatedly denied using Al-Shifa as a command and control center, calling the claims from Israel and the US baseless lies, fabricated narratives, and distorted information. The United Nations Human Rights Chief called on Israel to grant international investigators access to Gaza to investigate the competing claims about the hospital. Meanwhile, the Israeli army says troops recovered the body of a 65-year-old Israeli grandmother near the hospital. She had been kidnapped during the Hamas rampage on October 7. No details were released on how she died. The Israeli Prime Minister telling CBS it's possible other hostages were held at Al-Shifa.
Imagine the far left and the corporate media are downplaying last night's events. Go to Jeff Bezos' Washington Post, where allegedly democracy dies in darkness. Well, look for coverage of that mostly peaceful protest. You'll scroll down past stories on gun control, Israeli troops, going into a Gaza hospital looking for evidence of Hamas's presence. George Santos is there. RFK and the Golden Bachelor, where there was a story about the violent leftists assaulting cops at the DNC. I guess democracy died a little bit more in darkness today. The front page of the New York Times, by the way, it's not there either. But let's compare this coverage to January 6th. Protesters entered the Capitol and members of Congress evacuated the congressional chamber. Sounds a lot like last night. The coverage, however, was vastly different. New York Times, at the time, the top story was Trump incites the mob. He's a dictator. Now, let's not forget Democrats calling January 6th the greatest threat to America since 9/11 or Pearl Harbor. It was quite a comparison.
When our democracy came under assault. Dates that occupy not only a place on our calendars, but a place in our collective memory. December 7th, 1941, September 11th, 2001, and January 6th, 2021.
This really craziest attack since 9/11 to happen in this country.
President Franklin Roosevelt set aside December 7th, 1941 as a day that will live in infamy. Unfortunately, we can now add January 6th, 2021 to that very short list of dates in American history that will live forever in infamy.
The worst attack on our democracy since the Civil War.
Should we add November 15th to that list? Chuck E. Schumer. AOC last night posted on Twitter before the mostly peaceful protest began. The compulsive Twitterer posted on her usual socialist-adoring agenda. Somehow AOC couldn't find the time to tweet about the violence last night. Jamal Bowman hasn't tweeted about the mostly peaceful protest either. Maybe he thought he had to shelter in the basement because the fire alarm went off. Adam Schiff, the same. The list is never ending. All these loudmouth jihad squadsters, leftists, staying silent when it's their side creating the chaos is hypocrisy, shouting from the top of the hill, Capitol Hill. Of course, we expect AG Merrick Garland to strongly condemn this attack on democracy, right? Don't hold your breath. We expect that over the next few weeks, the DOJ will release videos to help identify and arrest the mostly peaceful protesters. Don't hold your breath. We expect them to be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. Well, maybe not, because after all, it doesn't fit the liberal agenda. You see, there's a bigger reason these people are keeping their normally flapping lips silent. This protest is not good for Biden's re-election campaign. It exposes the far left of the Democrat Party in all its glory, agonizing glory. And it shows that the Democrats are far less supportive of Israel than the greater American population. And that's bad for Sleepy Joe or whomever will be the Democrat nominee in 2024. In the 1960s, the far left staged protests and took over administration buildings at colleges all across the United States. They were supported by the faculty and the administrations of those colleges. But when the Democrat National Convention took place in Chicago, the site of violent protesters clashing with the Chicago police, CPD, it sent a message to American voters. The Democrat Party is a home for dangerously deranged individuals. The television coverage of the protests in Chicago led voters to elect Republican Richard Nixon over Democrat Hubert Humphrey. Nixon stood for law and order over the anarchy of the Democrats. The Democrats and the mainstream media understand this. This story cannot run, and here's the overall point. This new Democrat Party believes in defunding the police. It supports the George Soros-funded state and city district attorneys. These prosecutors seek either to release violent criminals without bail or sometimes reduce their felonies to misdemeanors. They believe the woke revolution of using race and gender in place of meritocracy. They should believe that should dominate government, the media, and corporate boardrooms. And now, if we stand down and allow the Democrat Party to take out the 2024 presidential frontrunner, Donald Trump, the main threat to their power with bogus criminal cases, well, we're done as a freedom and liberty-loving democratic republic. That precedent will live on forever. Voters will never determine the outcome of another election. After all the yelling permanent Washington has done about how January 6th was an existential threat to democracy itself, they've decided to short-circuit 245 years of constitutional republic elections. What happens if they win? A functioning justice system has kept the country peaceful for hundreds of years. The purpose of a justice system itself is to administer justice so that citizens don't have to do it themselves. And secondly, maybe even more importantly, justice needs to be administered so that lawbreakers have a deterrent. Punishment. Hello? The hypocrites running D.C. seem to understand the value of punishment when they administer biased decisions and sentences to January 6ers and Donald Trump. They just seem to forget the link between justice and punishment only when it's on their side doing the disruption. Are you paying attention yet? Are you? Okay, let's bring in Texas Senator Ted Cruz. Senator Cruz, right man, right time. Appreciate your time. We want to talk a little bit about this whole idea, the new protest. So,
Unbelievable.
Letter calling on President Biden to press for a bilateral ceasefire in Gaza on the basis of grave violations of children's rights. Letter was authored by Democratic Congress members Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez of New York, Mark Pocan of Wisconsin, and Betty McCollum of Minnesota. This comes as the powerful lobby group AIPAC, that's the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, steps up its support for primary challengers to lawmakers who voice support for a ceasefire. Slate magazine reports AIPAC is expected to spend $100 million in Democratic primaries backing opponents of House progressives. The Senate's approved a short-term funding bill to keep the government open until early 2024, sending the measure to President Biden for his signature ahead of a midnight deadline Friday to avert a government shutdown. Its passage on Wednesday came as far-right members of the House of Representatives rebelled against Republican Speaker Mike Johnson to punish party leaders for crafting a compromise bill with Democrats. The rebellion prompted Speaker Johnson to abruptly adjourn the House until after the Thanksgiving holiday. In Texas, 7 more women who were denied medically necessary abortions joined a lawsuit filed by the Center for Reproductive Rights against the state of Texas. There are now 22 plaintiffs as the case heads to the Texas Supreme Court later this month. The case seeks to clarify what constitutes a medical emergency, allowing for an abortion, and to permit doctors to make that call without fear of prosecution. One of the new plaintiffs is Danielle Matheson, who's an OBGYN who was forced to leave her home state just to get abortion care. Dr. Matheson said, quote, Texas lawmakers know nothing about medicine, and they have created a full-blown public health crisis, unquote. In related news, a federal judge last week blocked an Idaho law which made it a crime to help a minor cross state lines for an abortion without parental consent. The judge says the law, signed in April by Republican Governor Brad Little, violated the First Amendment. This comes as the Justice Department backed 2 lawsuits challenging a similar law in Alabama. And in Ghana, African leaders have issued a collective call for reparations for the historic enslavement of people of African descent. Togo's Prime Minister, Victoire Tomega Dogbe, was one of the speakers during the 2-day conference in Accra.
Le traumatisme psychologique infligé par
The psychological trauma inflicted by this abhorrent practice continues to resonate across generations, affecting our collective consciousness. Colonialism, with its arbitrary borders and economic exploitation, further reinforced racial hierarchies and sowed seeds of discord that persist to this day. The scars of exploitation, dispossession, and cultural erasure persist, manifesting themselves in contemporary challenges such as economic inequality, political instability, and cultural disintegration.
And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!
That's going to be all for today. It's unbelievable how much stuff's going on. Unbelievable. Good luck to all of us. Shalom.